The Prime Minister tells us to be prepared for our lives to change dramatically if we want to defeat coronavirus. Britons should avoid the office, pubs, social gatherings, and whole households should now stay at home if one person has symptoms, but schools remain open.
I can't remember anything like it in my lifetime. I don't think there's really been anything like it in peacetime.
In the first of what will be a daily national address, the Prime Minister and his advisers warned the fight against COVID-19 would be a long one.
We should not be under any illusions that if we just do this for a couple of weeks, that is sufficient. This is going to have to be a prolonged period.
As the number of people to die in the UK reaches 55, we will examine this enormous change in policy and the impact it will have on our lives, the economy and the NHS. Also in News at 10 tonight. The son of a coronavirus victim tells us about the heartbreaking reality of what it's like to lose a loved one to the disease sweeping the globe.
I held his hand, I stroked his hair, and I said what a beautiful March day it was. There's a lovely blue sky, and he said, I hope to be out in 3 days to see that.
The airline industry on the brink as planes are grounded and border after border closes across the world. And in America, President Trump bans gatherings of more than 10 people and closes schools across the entire country.
This is ITV News at 10 with Raghi Omar.
Good evening. The word unprecedented is often overused in describing moments of national life. But tonight, it is a fitting description of the announcements made by the Prime Minister and his senior scientific advisers in Number 10 this afternoon, when describing how all our daily lives would have to change in order to combat the spread of coronavirus in the UK. In the first of what will be televised daily briefings to the country, Boris Johnson advised that we'd all have to take dramatic steps in our everyday routines. We should stop going to the pub, the theatre and other social events. We should avoid any unnecessary travel or social contacts. We should work from home and the whole household should go into quarantine if any one is showing symptoms of the virus. The Prime Minister and his advisers stopped short of closing schools or making these measures compulsory, but they did warn us that this process could last a long time.
A global epidemic now spreading fastest across Europe, with the UK's infection rate about to rise to dangerous levels, as the Prime Minister, flanked by his medical and scientific advisers, conceded.
Without drastic action, cases could double every 5 or 6 days.
So we're all being asked to fundamentally change how we live and work. And if anyone in your household has a fever or persistent cough, everyone living with you is being asked to stay at home for 14 days.
That means that if possible, you should not go out even to buy food or essentials other than for exercise, and in that case, at a safe distance from others. If necessary, you should ask for help from others for your daily necessities.
And even if we're not sick, we're being urged to stay away from people.
Now is the time for everyone to stop non-essential contact with others and to stop all unnecessary travel. We need people to start working from home where they possibly can, and you should avoid pubs, clubs, theatres and other such social venues.
This shunning of social contact is most urgent, the PM said, for those over 70, pregnant women and the frail. And there will be special measures for the very frail.
In a few days' time, by this coming weekend, it will be necessary to go further and to ensure that those with the most serious health conditions are largely shielded from contact, from social contact, for around 12 weeks.
Johnson also took steps to call a halt to all big leisure events, though schools are not being closed yet. The Chief Medical Officer explained why these draconian measures are coming now.
In this country, This disease is now accelerating up the curve, but it is still at a low level, but it will accelerate up now really quite rapidly. This is going to go on for some time. And I think we should not be under any illusions that if we just do this for a couple of weeks, that is sufficient. This is going to have to be a prolonged period.
Clearly, what we're announcing today is a very substantial change in the way that we want people to live their lives. And I can't remember anything like it in my lifetime. I don't think there's really been anything like it in peacetime.
I asked one of the government's advisors on how diseases spread how long we would be living with these constraints.
Our best estimates are these measures will be successful at suppressing transmission. If they're lifted, and when they're lifted, transmission is likely to bounce back. Now, there may be in time other approaches we can take to keep case numbers low, but we are going to be living with this virus really this year, probably next year, until we have a vaccine.
Neil Ferguson's research was warning that unless we all isolate, as the Prime Minister urges, the NHS could collapse and there would be 250,000 deaths. And Neil Ferguson also told me that unless we do what the Prime Minister says, in just 3 weeks, Boris Johnson may well be back here announcing criminal sanctions against those breaking what is in effect a curfew. Robert Peston, News at 10.
On top of advising everyone to avoid close social contact, the government has issued specific guidance to some groups who are most at risk. The Prime Minister strongly urged the advice be followed by pregnant women, those over 70, and anyone who has an underlying health condition who would normally be recommended to take the flu vaccine by their doctor. For the 1.4 million most vulnerable, though, the government is going even further. They say they should be completely shielded from social contact for 12 weeks. This includes people with compromised immune systems, like those undergoing chemotherapy or with organ failure. For everyone else, it's all about limiting social contact, working from home, not going to pubs, clubs or theatres, the impact of which will be far-reaching and significant. Tonight, big sporting events like the Grand National, the boat race, all have been called off. Theatres across the country are closing, and the pub industry says that if it doesn't get urgent help from the government, it will find it hard to survive.
As a symbol of British life, there is still nothing that quite matches the pub. The centre of many a community, the local, an entire nation is now being advised to avoid.
Well, it's been pretty devastating. I'm very fortunate. I have some very loyal, dedicated customers. But if people are actually being told not to come to pubs, it is going to be very harsh.
But it's not an explicit ban, so the industry says insurers won't pay out. It warns some pubs will call last orders forever.
This is going to result in real pub closures and tens of thousands of job losses. We have over 600,000 jobs that we provide all across the country. They are under threat.
And we're being told to stay away from theatres and clubs. In the West End, the show must no longer go on.
I'm completely worried about the whole impact on theatre, not only because the cast will have to go out, but it's also the huge amount of people to put on these shows, the front of house, the box office, and people like me. I work essentially freelance. I'm not on PAYE, so if the show closes tomorrow, I'm out of a job completely.
Tonight, the curtain came down prematurely on the hit musical Hamilton, London's hottest ticket. Customers were promised a refund, but not a date for when they might take their seats again.
I work with the airlines, and I know that there's a problem. We've canceled a lot of flights. I was surprised this was still operating, but no, I understand it.
And so the lights are going off across the West End, as they are on so many facets of the life we took for granted. And no one can say for sure when normality will return.
For pregnant women, it's an incredibly vulnerable time.
Chelsea Groom is expecting a baby in 3 months. Today, she and every other pregnant woman was added to the group judged to be at risk.
We've been told as pregnant women that we are meant to take precautions and socially isolate as much as possible. However, that doesn't stop other people in our household still having to go out to work and potentially bringing the virus back into the family household.
Tomorrow, this Hindu temple in Leicester will close its doors for fear of coronavirus. The way we live, even the way we pray, everything is changing. John Ray, News at 10.
And Robert joins me in the studio now. Robert, just trying to put into context for us how profound you think this moment is for all of us?
Well, I think it's huge. I mean, as the Prime Minister himself said, these are the greatest restrictions on our way of life in peacetime. I don't think he's wrong about that. And the reason that they've been brought about is because the government's own advisors on how diseases spread were saying that unless they massively speeded up plans that were being worked on to increase our isolation as individuals, actually there could have been 260,000 deaths in a relatively short space of time, with demand for NHS acute beds being outstripping supply, by 8-fold. So the NHS would have crashed. So, frankly, the Prime Minister and his senior ministers who sit on the Emergency Cobra Committee had no choice but, as I say, to make these historic announcements.
And do you think, I mean, it's almost an impossible question to sort of say, but do you think enough things are in place for this to sort of work?
We don't know. I mean, I was talking to one of those senior advisors of the Prime Minister this evening, Neil Ferguson, and he said he is hopeful that we will do what the Prime Minister asks. So stay indoors for 14 days if just one member of our family is sick. If we are older, refrain from almost all social contact. Obviously, if you're very vulnerable, they are basically forcing you to avoid social contact. Now, if within 3 weeks, and 3 weeks is all we've got to see if these measures work, it is clear that the rate of increase of this disease is still accelerating, at that point they are going to turn these measures from voluntary ones into legal ones with criminal sanctions attached.
That is quite something to ponder. Robert, thank you very much indeed. But one of the main groups of people affected by the new measures are the over 70s. And for many, limiting social contact is a hard ask, whether it's grandparents who look after grandchildren or those that rely on organised groups for social interaction.
Even before today's new advice, many older people were distancing themselves from each other. This class to improve balance and mobility was already half empty. It may now have been the last one for some time. It may not be essential social contact, but it is important.
I think it's very disappointing for people like me who are going to be deprived of social activity. I don't know what we can do about it. I think we're doing the best we can.
If it happens, if I catch it, I will be one of the ones that pops my clogs. So I'm quite happy to conform to what I have to do.
But some are worried about the social isolation that might result.
Hello, Eddie. We just want to keep our distance, but we want to keep in contact as well. So
supporting older members of the congregation is now a priority for this priest. Angela is 90 and not yet sure if today's advice against non-essential travel will mean having to cancel visits from her closest family.
My son lives in Somerset. He and my daughter-in-law, they probably come perhaps once every 6 weeks or something. I mean, they are my nearest and dearest, and they're the people that are very important to me, and that would upset me very, very much.
Some people, like Malcolm, dislike being singled out because of their age alone. At 72, he believes he's fitter and healthier than many younger people and fears further restrictions being imposed.
If it means that I can't play tennis or cycle and join a community, because we have a lot of social tennis here and social cycling, then it would be very difficult.
Like many, he now has decisions to make, whether he continues to see his grandchildren, which parts of his lifestyle have to change, as balancing health and happiness begins to get harder. Ben Chapman, News at 10, Oxfordshire.
Well, today in the UK, there was another increase in the number of cases and deaths. Across the UK, more than 1,500 people have now tested positive for the virus. 55 people have died. In Spain, which now has the fourth highest number of cases in the world, over 9,000 people have been infected and more than 300 have died. Not far behind is France, where there have been more than 6,000 confirmed cases and 148 deaths. While in Italy, the worst affected country outside of China, nearly 28,000 have contracted the virus and more than 2,000 people have died. It is those types of numbers that so concern the government here. Having seen how quickly other health services have been overwhelmed, they are now doing everything they can to prepare the NHS for what is likely to come.
It's here that the NHS will be tested to its limit. Intensive care units where the critically ill are being treated. There are warnings every unit could be full very soon. With such huge demand, obvious questions about how the service will cope.
We know that the UK has about a quarter of the critical care beds compared to nations like Germany. So it's so important that those beds, that the patients are targeted to prevent them falling ill.
At the very worst, the government's preparing for 80% of us to get coronavirus. That's 53 million people. 5% could be critical. That's 2.6 million. But the UK only has just over 4,000 intensive care beds, 2.1 for every 1,000. Much fewer than countries like Germany, Italy and France. Many, if not all, critically ill will need ventilator support. But at the moment, there are just 5,000 available.
Ventilation is mission critical to treating this disease, and we've been buying up ventilation equipment since the start of the crisis. But we need more, and today the Prime Minister hosted a call with the nation's advanced manufacturers, asking them to join a national effort.
This manufacturer in Kent could help in that effort. The concern here, though, is getting parts quickly.
We can see lead times up to 4 or 5 months, and that's what's really going to drive the challenge, is how quickly can we get those parts and how quickly can we get them in. You know, we've got the capacity, we've got the capability, but we are really at the mercy of those supply chains.
A lack of equipment is just part of the problem. Staffing issues are causing great concern for the health service. It's very likely that many doctors and nurses could become ill or are forced to self-isolate, and only specially trained staff can use much of the equipment. Nikki Credland trains specialist nurses. She's worried about the government's ambitions of increasing capacity.
For every increase in bed, we should be increasing our staffing ratio by 4.66 qualified nurses, which quite clearly the figure Matt Hancock suggested was 5,000 new intensive care beds. So that's looking at over 20,000 new fully qualified intensive care staff, of which simply don't exist. Even if this company can make hundreds of desperately needed ventilators, the question is, will there be enough staff to operate them? Emily Morgan, News at 10.
The Prime Minister had warned that many of us would, as he put it, lose loved ones before their time. But rarely have we heard the unvarnished truth of what that reality is in the way Jonathan Blakely described to us how he lost his beloved father before his time. At the age of 88, Darryl died in an isolation unit at North Manchester General Hospital after contracting coronavirus.
Darryl Blakely was 88 years old, active and full of life. 13 days ago, he was admitted to hospital with a temperature. Last Friday, his son Jonathan said goodbye to him, knowing he was dying of coronavirus.
The most terrifying thing I've ever done in my own life, and I can't believe I'm saying that about my own father. I had to wear a full-sleeved, full-length gown, plastic apron, a tight-fitting face mask with a rubber seal, 2 pairs of gloves, and then a plastic shield, and this was to see my own father. My mask was just full of tears and steamed up. It was so upsetting, and he didn't really know what was going on at that stage. I was so shocked because he just couldn't breathe properly. His lungs were filling with fluid and were rattling. I held his hand, I stroked his hair, and I said what a beautiful March day it was. There's a lovely blue sky, and he said, I hope to be out in 3 days to see that. And I just said, well, yeah, we're looking forward to that. I had to think on the split second, do I tell him a lie or do I tell him the truth? And I chose to tell a white lie.
If anyone can learn anything from what you've experienced, what must that be?
Pull together as a community. Be sensible. don't go into crowded places, live differently. It might mean that you can't see your favourite football team or go to the cinema, but the more that we're around other people, the more that this is going to spread.
To this family, COVID-19 has dealt the cruelest blow. They hope people will respond to the threat with compassion. Damon Green, News at 10, Manchester.
The scale of the impact of the pandemic on the world's airlines became even more stark today as carrier after carrier announced dramatic cuts. The owner of British Airways announced the grounding of 3/4 of its planes, while Virgin Atlantic told staff they would need to take 8 weeks unpaid leave. In fact, Europe's biggest airline, Ryanair, said it couldn't rule out grounding its entire fleet in the coming days.
Heathrow is one of the world's busiest airports. Aircraft still come and go, but things are slowing down here. Flights are being grounded. The airline industry is gradually but steadily shutting down.
This is worse than any other previous crisis that's been reported. So whether that's the ash cloud, whether that's SARS, swine flu, everybody is reporting to me from a management level down to our members on the ground that this is the worst crisis they've seen in aviation.
Flight bookings have collapsed, travel restrictions are getting harsher. This is what departures at Gatwick look like this morning. And under massive pressure, airlines are cutting costs. Ryanair, EasyJet, Virgin and IAG, which owns British Airways, are reducing their schedules in the coming weeks by as much as 85%. Meanwhile, TUI is grounding its fleet of aircraft and suspending the vast majority of its holidays until further notice. Tens of thousands of staff have been told that pay and hours will be cut. Virgin Atlantic is asking its 8,500 staff to take 8 weeks of unpaid leave in the next 3 months to avoid redundancies. Less than 2 weeks ago, the government decided to allow Flybe to collapse, but that was a deeply troubled airline. We're now in a truly remarkable situation where much bigger, much more successful airlines are telling ministers they're unlikely to survive without state aid. The government insists it will help out, but hasn't yet said how.
Good businesses that, if it were not for this coronavirus, would absolutely, flourish and succeed, should be enabled to survive through this emergency.
Airlines are at the sharp end of a massive downturn. Their shares were being sold again today, but the sell-off was widespread. Investors believe all companies are vulnerable, big and small, from all sectors of the economy.
We certainly are seeing a massive amount of panic. Our government's doing enough? They're not doing enough so far. We've had various central banks cut interest rates and go down the stimulus package route. We've seen some of that from government, not a whole lot.
There are signs of distress everywhere. Debenhams has asked its landlords for a 5-month rent holiday. Meanwhile, PSA announced that its Vauxhall car factories at Luton and Ellesmere Port will shut down temporarily in the next 4 days. There'll be plenty more of this to come.
And Joel is here. Joel, I mean, there's obviously the human cost, but there's also the economic cost, isn't there? I mean, there's been another dreadful day on the markets. The FTSE's down. The Wall Street had one of its worst days for 3 decades. And it goes on and on. Interventions from central banks. Where are we?
Well, the central bank interventions aren't proving terribly effective thus far. They're pulling the levers that are there to help them protect the economy, but fear is still sweeping through financial markets. Now, the Bank of England last week cut interest rates. More importantly, it did something rather sophisticated to incentivise bank lending. The new governor of the Bank of England is a man called Andrew Bailey. Believe it or not, Raggy, today was his first day in the job.
Quite a day.
Bailey's, what a day. He says he's ready to do more, if necessary, to prevent businesses from being wiped out and people losing their jobs. And that's what this is about. But in truth, Raggy, there's very little that's really effective, more that central banks can do. Companies are running short of cash. They are turning now to the government for help. Last week in the budget, less than a week ago, the Chancellor announced a series of support measures totalling £7 billion. They included tax cuts, help with sick pay, help with borrowing money. Now, these were seen as sensible and well-designed measures. But now, the scale of what's necessary, there's a lot of pressure on the government to do much, 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 much more, because the scale of what's to come seems very substantial. We're looking at a very significant economic shock, one you could argue not created by greedy banks, but actually by an act of God, for want of a better expression. And there is one idea doing the rounds that governments will will borrow billions of pounds and act a bit like an insurer, put it directly into the pockets of businesses and households that stand to suffer greatly through no fault of their own. Cost of doing that, enormous. Cost of not doing that, enormous.
OK, Joel, thank you very much indeed. Now, just as Wall Street was closing, President Trump made one of his increasingly regular appearances in the White House's press briefing room. He told America it was now fighting an invisible enemy, saying that Americans should avoid bars, restaurants, anywhere people might gather in groups of 10 or more. It's a far cry from his attempts to play down the threat that coronavirus poses just a matter of days ago.
In New Orleans this weekend, police attempted to clear the crowded streets, telling people to return to their homes.
Your actions are jeopardizing public health, and we are directing you to clear the streets.
Americans are having to learn fast that this is no longer business as usual, that the virus is here and spreading fast. To a White House press corps carefully spaced out, the president issued new guidelines tonight for the entire country.
Therefore, my administration is recommending that all Americans, including the young and healthy, work to engage in schooling from home when possible, avoid gathering in groups of more than 10 people, avoid discretionary travel, and avoid eating and drinking at bars, restaurants, and public food courts.
That is likely to only accelerate concerns and lead to more empty shelves. Long queues are already forming in car parks outside of supermarkets. And perhaps inevitably, there is a major surge in those seeking their idea of the ultimate protection. Gun sales are soaring. America is effectively closing down for business. This is Chicago on the eve of St. Patrick's Day, adhering to the advice of officials.
I do not want to see hordes of people out in the streets. The bars will be shut. So please stay home and be safe.
And New York, the city that never stops, is preparing to stop. Cinemas and theatres are now closed. Restaurants are empty. And both the governor and the mayor made clear that even famously resilient New Yorkers could not simply shrug this off.
I am very, very concerned that we see a rapid spread of this disease, and it is time to take more dramatic measures.
Some American airports are scenes of chaos. Incoming passengers being forced to crowd together, contradicting all public health advice. Other airports are empty, as the US adds Britain to the flight ban in the next few hours. Many of this country's most vulnerable people, the 500,000 homeless, the tens of millions of Americans who have no health insurance, are now left in a world of uncertainty and confusion.
And I'm very worried about it. I'm just concerned because I don't know if they're taking the precautions to keep us safe.
At the White House itself, measures to protect the president include temperature scans of all visitors, as this administration scrambles for a coherent strategy. The president has certainly strengthened his message here today, acknowledging these measures may be in place until the late summer, meaning the American economy and its most vulnerable communities have to face a prolonged crisis. Robert Moore, News at 10, at the White House.
Now, when Donald Trump announced his travel ban last week, European leaders were quick to criticise. Today, France's President Macron declared we are at war as the EU imposed its own travel ban. From midday tomorrow, borders at the entrance to the EU will be closed and remain so for 30 days. Internal borders, too, will close as countries increasingly attempt to isolate themselves and their people from the virus. In Spain, like elsewhere, that means an end to normal life as we know it.
Monday morning rush hour in Spain's second city. The only people allowed to walk the streets are those travelling to work or tourists leaving the city. Public transport is running, but it's quieter than ever. You can still travel almost anywhere, even though the advice is to stay at home. 4 towns near Barcelona remain sealed off because of a rapid outbreak of COVID-19. Police guard always in, allowing only essential supplies beyond the cordon. No one can leave for another 2 weeks. Another 1,400 people in Spain tested positive for coronavirus in the last 24 hours. There's not enough supplies for the emergency services helping those with symptoms. With more than 9,000 confirmed cases, Spain is the 4th most infected country in the world. Demand is such that police have seized 150,000 masks from a factory to distribute to hospitals.
You must stay safely at your accommodation or home.
Some Brits in Benidorm surprisingly ignored the instructions to stay inside, keen to carry on enjoying their holidays in the sunshine.
It says there's a flu that we just all need to get over. Have a beer. Happy days. Ciao, guys.
Police were called to get them back to their hotels. Stopping the virus entering Spain is the latest tactic of the authorities. Coronavirus is now testing a key fundamental of the European Union, free movement of people. At this border crossing between Spain and France, there haven't been checks here for decades. From midday tomorrow, movement across EU borders will be severely restricted to stop the spread of coronavirus. The measures will last for at least 30 days. Stacey Foster, News at 10, Catalonia.
And finally, something just a little lighter from Spain that punches through some of the gloom we've been covering. The government asks us to reduce the contact with each other as much as possible, but there's a lesson from isolation in that country that it doesn't necessarily mean remaining idle. A fitness instructor in Seville took to the rooftop to lead an impromptu workout for people stuck in their homes, and many can be seen joining in from their balconies, proving that quarantine is no excuse for skipping exercise. And that's it from us. Have a very good night.